Welcome to Afghan Vetting, Can It Be Done? I'm Mahvash Siddiqui. I'm a Foreign Service Officer by trade. I joined the State Department in 2004. I have experience in crisis response, national security issues, and consular issues. It's my privilege today to introduce you to today's panelists. The first is ladies first, so Jessica Vaughan. Jessica is the Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. She is a former State Department Foreign Service officer and a leading expert on immigration enforcement and national security. She has testified before Congress many times and regularly advises lawmakers and law enforcement. Next is Art, or Andrew Arthur. He goes by Art preferably. He's a former immigration judge and currently a resident fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies. He previously served in senior oversight roles in the U.S. House of Representatives and helped draft major homeland security and immigration laws. Kudos. He has testified before Congress on immigration, security, and terrorism issues. And finally, last but not the least, Simon Hankinson. Simon is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, focusing on immigration and border security. He spent more than 20 years at the State Department as a Foreign Service officer with assignments around the world, and now writes and speaks widely on immigration and foreign policy. Before we dive into their remarks, I want to frame this discussion with two short stories or observations, not to relitigate Afghanistan, but to explain how warning signals were missed by the US government, how vetting authority was fractured, and why Congress and our lawmakers should care about the next evacuation and about the current vetting posture. So before Kabul fell, well before the withdrawal, US diplomats sent a formal dissent cable. This was about 9 months before Afghanistan fell, warning that collapse was imminent, that warning was heavily ignored. Some of those diplomats reached out to me while I was serving as the deputy director of the Iran Threat Directorate at the Global Engagement Center. The job of the Global Engagement Center, as appropriated by the Congress, was to fight foreign malign influence. So essentially, these diplomats reached out to say, Mahvash, there's massive influence operations going on against us. We are seeing an uptick in negative messaging against the US government. This is going to destabilize our operations. Having studied information operations at the Marine War College, I understand that, influence operations can become kinetic. And for lack of a better way to put it, the shit starts hitting the fan. So essentially, when the dissent cable came in, I reached out as the deputy director of the Iran Threat Directorate to the leadership at the Global Engagement Center saying, hey guys, it's our job to fight this foreign malign influence. Iran, China, and Russia were converging together to say bad things about the United States, to basically destabilize our operations and undermining the confidence of the people of Afghanistan and in the US commitments there. I urged the GEC leadership to deploy a counter-messaging campaign, which had already architected. That recommendation was resisted. They said, we need to focus on Russia. We have better fish to fry on. So there was no effective counter-narrative in place, and then Kabul fell 9 months down the road, and then the evacuation began. I was very mad about this whole situation. Taking my fury, I went to the OIG, basically saying the Global Engagement Center is navel-gazing. They're doing counter-messaging operations against Americans, but they didn't do their basic job. Their modus operandi should have been to fight foreign malign influence in Afghanistan, which is a big priority for us from the national security perspective. The OIG decided to do a massive inspection, and guess what happened? My director, Sarah Burnett, and others basically decided to flee to work on the Afghan relocation efforts. That was really rich, but not only did they do that, as a whistleblower, I felt basically, the hell broke loose. I was demeaned in front of the rest of the GEC leadership. Our front office means the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy scolded me, and as a whistleblower, I, faced a lot of backlash, just like one of the colleagues who reported his whistleblowing, and I had to curtail and leave the Global Engagement Center. Now, the Iran Threat Directorate's leadership and others went off to work now at CARE. And they were the ones who decided to bring in every Tom, Dick, and Harry into the United States. The second story I wanted to tell was essentially, so Kabul fell, and the influx of Afghans started in the United States, in Doha, at Camp Asaliya, Doha, which was a very good U.S. military installation. When I was a public diplomacy officer in Qatar, I believe that the operations that they were doing to vet, other concerns were really strong. And the U.S. Army-led vetting unit initially that was working in Doha did a fantastic job of doing biometric screening. They had a structured review of these Afghan nationals. They had clear chains of command. They were also synced up with the FBI and the U.S. State Department's diplomatic security folks. But once vetting was consolidated under the State Department authority, because of not the National Security Council, we're talking about John Feiner and Jake Sullivan, basically who were friends with the ambassador in Qatar, Tim Davis. They decided to get Tim Davis to be the sort of dominant authority over vetting. And when that happened, things kind of went really loosey-goosey. There was intense pressure for all consular officers to issue. The FBI and the diplomatic security folks, they brought up derogatory information about certain applicants that was brushed away very ferociously by the ambassador the then ambassador Tim Davis. And essentially, speed overtook scrutiny thanks to pressure from the Biden National Security Council. The result was a fragmented accountability concern, uneven standards, no single entity clearly owning the national security risk that was being accepted. So those are oversight questions, not partisan ones, and they are the focus of this panel. With that, I'll turn it over to our panelists. Let's start with Art.
Thank you so much, Ma. Appreciate it. And, one of the things that we really haven't talked about is why we were in Afghanistan, a country called the Graveyard of Empires, to begin with. Go back to the late 80s, early 90s. Osama bin Laden was actually in Afghanistan, and then he moved his operations to Sudan in 1991. While he was in Sudan, he got caught attempting to assassinate Hosni Mubarak, amongst other things, and the Clinton administration. Hillary Clinton probably thought, you can't get rid of Hosni Mubarak, only I can do that. And so consequently, we put pressure on Sudan. We blew up an aspirin factory. And bin Laden ended up going back to Afghanistan in 1996, where he was under the protection of the Taliban. Fast forward to September the 9th, 2001. The Taliban was battling the Northern Alliance. You probably remember that. And on that day, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of the Panjshir, was assassinated by a supposed TV news crew that had a bomb in their camera, killing him and really sort of insulating the Taliban against any resistance in the country when September 11th was coming, it started. So this was a group of people that really kind of ab initio didn't like the United States. October 7th, 2001, the United States started bombing Afghanistan. That was the start of operations in the country. And the Taliban actually unraveled pretty quickly thereafter, especially after the loss at Mazar-e-Sharif on October the 9th at the hands of a ethnic Uzbek military leader, Abdul Rashid Dostum. So, shortly thereafter, the Taliban began to fall apart. There were battles in Bamiyan, Herat, Kabul, Jalalabad, and, the whole thing just sort of, the whole structure began to dissolve, and they sort of disappeared into the woodwork. Hamid Karzai, of course, thereafter was installed as an interim leader. Hamid Karzai, his brother at the time, actually ran a very good Afghan restaurant in Baltimore, but he was a very respected figure in Afghanistan. Then we had George Bush announce the beginning of Afghan reconstruction, which I did have the chance to ask Nick about in April of 2002. That truly is, by the way, if we ever do another one of these panels, we should do a case study of how not to rebuild a country. So DOD announced the end of major combat in Afghanistan in 2003, but just 3 years later, in July 2006, a violent resurgence broke out. We started to see more suicide attacks. They quintupled from 27 in 2005 to 139 in 2006. There were a lot of IEDs. We started to see more green on blue attacks in which purportedly loyal Afghan troops turned on their NATO allies. Then there was a start in November of 2010 in Lisbon of peace talks with the Taliban with an idea that we're going to hand over full security for Afghanistan to Afghan forces by the end of 2014. The Taliban got involved in talks, then pulled out in talks. Even though there were, ongoing attacks against NATO and Afghan allied forces by the Taliban during that period. February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed an agreement for a major drawdown of U.S. troops in the region, with intra-Afghan talks actually starting so that we could, sort of come to some sort of agreement against the government that we'd established in Afghan and the Taliban, hopefully that would lead to peace. Then, of course, in April 2021, the Biden administration decided that it was going to pick the worst date that it could possibly choose to withdraw its troops, September 11th, 2021, 20 years to the day of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. And I was down the street in that building, and that was an exciting day, let me tell you. In the summer of 2021, as we heard, the United States withdrew its military and diplomatic personnel from Afghanistan. And the White House launched what was called Operation Allies Refuge, which we heard about before, with the State Department as the lead to help relocate potentially eligible Afghan nationals and their immediate family members, given those SIVs that we discussed. Then on October 29th, this goes to a point that Naila was talking about, President Biden tasked probably the most competent man he could think of, Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, to coordinate across the federal government to resettle vulnerable Afghans, and that was Operation Allies Welcome. Second, now this all sounds great on paper. Secretary Mayorkas established a unified coordination group, the UCG, to ensure federal resources, authorities, and expertise were used in a unified and synchronized manner to support the goals of Operation Allies Welcome. Of course, August the 30th, 2021, complete withdrawal. We are out of Afghanistan 12 days early. Between July 2021 and January 2022, and this goes to what Congressman Biggs said today, DHS paroled approximately 77,000 evacuees from Afghanistan. Of course, that's the subject of everything we've been talking about today. Evacuees were first sent to lily pads, which served as transit points to screen and vet evacuees prior to their arrival in the United States. DOD provided temporary housing, sustenance, and other support there. They were then sent to safe havens, of course, in the United States and military bases across the United States. Nick had spoken about that today. Just trying to pull all this together to set the stage for what comes next. Because here's what we found out even in real time and even more at the end. DHS OIG reported that both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense had very limited time to conduct the complex screening and vetting of the evacuees. DHS OIG reported that over 40,000 evacuees were sent to a military base in Germany where DHS and DOD had 10 days to vet and screen them. 40,000 people, 10 days. In addition, according to DHS OIG, fundamental biographic information used to vet those evacuees through U.S. government bases was lacking, such as name, date of birth, identification number, travel document data, was either inaccurate, incomplete, or missing. Those failures resulted in CBP paroling at least 2 evacuees who posed a risk to the national security and the safety of local communities and may have admitted or paroled others. We just don't know. Then there's the fact that DOD-OIG issued a February 2022 report. Remember, we were only gone for about 4 months when this report came out, that found that some Afghan parolees were not vetted by the National Counterterrorism Center, which is under the DNI, using all of DOD's data. Well, you're asking, how could that have happened? DOD was really the big dog in Afghanistan. How did we not use that? Here's what happened. Half of the Afghan evacuees were enrolled by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, at lily pads abroad. And their information was stored in DHS's Automated Biographical Information System, which is known as IDENT, and compared against information in that system. So that's how you do vetting. You get a name, you get an identity, you compare it against the information that you see. Remember James Comey saying, you know, your vetting is only as good as the information you have? That's really what you were talking about. The other half, however, were enrolled by the Department of Defense, and their information was stored and screened against that department's automated biometric identification system called IBIS. DOD-OIG explained that both the DOD and the CBP enrollment information was then sent to the National Targeting Center. Okay, so that somebody can actually take a look at this, figure out what's going on, which forwarded that information to the NCTC to send it back to the FBI. There's a lot of acronyms involved in all this. Against FBI's terrorist databases to see whether they have any DROG, as we say in Washington, derogatory information, or if additional scrutiny was required. Once those checks were completed, they were then sent to CBP and DOD's National Ground Intelligence Center, NGIC. I should have provided a glossary, handed that out ahead of time so you'd be able to know. It's NGIC's job then to let operators abroad at air departure points, they would give them a list of evacuees. These are the people who were cleared, so that they could create the flight manifest that would bring these people out. And it was CBP's job to tell the airports that they were coming. Here's the problem. DHS's IDENT system, against which half of all of those people were vetted, contained some, but not all, the information that was in DOD's ABIS system, due to DOD's agreements with foreign partners prohibiting the sharing of certain information in the DOD ABIS system. Now remember, I'm going to take us back to the 9/11 Commission. The big thing that the 9/11 Commission wanted to do away with when we had a director of national intelligence was that we were going to get rid of stovepiping. And this is probably the purest example of stovepiping that you could imagine. Half of these people were vetted under one system and half of them were vetted under the other, which means that half of them weren't vetted against the system that our foreign allies gave us information about the fingerprints that showed up on IEDs. They weren't checked against that at all. So the question becomes, how good is the vetting of those other people? We're never going to know. We're not going to know too late. Anyway, in addition, DHS-OIG concluded that CBP had allowed 35 evacuees to board flights to the United States, even though they hadn't received the green status, clearing them to travel, and failed to collect fingerprints from an additional 1,300 people prior to their travel to the United States. Step back to the period of time that they're being brought to the United States, that the Biden administration is promising us that we are going to have the tightest vetting ever of these individuals. None of that was true. In any event, Afghans with green status were then cleared to proceed to safe havens and military bases throughout the United States. Nick, again, this was a great point you made. DHS eventually determined that approximately 11,700 of the evacuees just left the safe havens on their own. They got tired, they left. 600 of whom, now remember, this is at the height of COVID, hadn't completed their medical screening, amongst other things. They hadn't received their vaccinations before. They just simply wandered off into the United States. DHS struggled to keep track of them thereafter, and the IG determined that the department had a, quote, fragmented process for identifying and resolving issues for Operation Allies Welcome parolees with derogatory information. This siloed approach, these stovepipes that we swore up and down that we were going to do away with in the wake of September 11th, came back It's like we knocked down the factory and we built it up again exactly the way that we had it before. It's as if September 11th never happened. Here comes a good part. You're going to like this one. USCIS failed to initiate removal proceedings to terminate parole whenever it denied a benefit application to somebody because of derogatory information. The only way we can get somebody out of the United States is if we put them in removal proceedings. USCIS gets derogatory information. They don't get the benefit, but they also aren't forced to leave. Here's really what it comes down to. And of course, I'm wearing my purple tie because I am a lawyer. Mark had said there were 2 doctors on the panel. Technically, I am one, but I call her Mav, she calls me Art. That's really what I am. If you are, and I'm talking to a room of State Department people, I feel ridiculous saying this. If you are attempting to get into the United States, you bear the sole burden. You have to answer every question that we want. The United States government doesn't bear any of that burden in that process. You bear the burden, and it doesn't shift until after you're in the United States and you're admitted to this country. Once you're inside the United States, if we want to deport you, I can give you a ground of deportation. You know, you were parolee, you're out of parole status, you're now returned to the status of a person who doesn't have any right to enter the United States. When you apply for asylum or you apply for any other benefit, having been a trial attorney, and I have derogatory information, I then bear the burden on the part of the United States government to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that you are a danger to the national security, that you are an individual who has committed a serious non-political crime abroad, that you are an individual who is barred from receiving asylum on any ground. That's the difference. I have to carry that burden, and then if I can prove it, the burden shifts back to you. But remember that whole DOD thing, foreign partners? What if that information's classified? What if I have to offer it against you? What if I can't get it declassified? Now, technically, as a trial attorney, I can do that ex parte in camera hearing. Judges hate that because you don't go to law school to learn how to be a lawyer when there's not another lawyer in the room. Everything that they did made this process so much more difficult. We can talk about it. We can have questions about that afterwards. But let me just give you this as a coda. We talked about Joe Kent before, National Counterterrorism Center Director. He testified on December 11th that NCTC has identified 2,000 Afghans who entered the country as part of Operation LS Welcome and who have ties to terrorist organizations. That's 2,000 removal hearings where 2,000 trial attorneys are going to have to convince probably pretty clerical judges that individuals pose a danger to the national security. This is a self-inflicted wound. We did this to ourselves. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you so much, Art, for those sobering and yet enlightening comments. Over to Jessica Vaughan.
Thank you, Mahvash. And thank you all for being here. A lot of really fascinating discussion. I am not a coroner, but I work in a think tank. But I love a good postmortem. I think that they are extremely useful for policy purposes to learn from things that went wrong, and try to figure out how we can avoid that going forward. So I've gone back and reviewed dozens of cases of Afghans who turned out to be a threat to our security after they've arrived here. There's been a couple people have mentioned, Phil and Art have talked about how the lessons of 9/11 seem to have been forgotten by those who were running this SIV and parole programs. But I can tell you there's an even more recent lesson that should have been in focus for the folks. And I want to talk a little bit about that particular case. After we had 9/11, we had 9/09, which was not a successful attack, but it was a plot that was concocted by about 12 citizens of Afghanistan who had come to the United States and hatched a plot. They were recruited and trained and supervised by Al-Qaeda. This is the plot known now as the New York subway plot of 2009. And there was a linked plot that was supposed to happen on the same day, also thwarted in Manchester, England, to blow up. In New York, they wanted to blow up Grand Central Station and a number of other points on the subway. There were 3 guys who were going to carry it out. So I want to give you some background about that plot and then tie it together with some of the more recent cases and hopefully offer a couple lessons from that I think are instructive. The key people involved in the New York subway plot were members of a family by the name of Zazi. And as I said, there were about 12 people involved. Almost all of them were citizens of Afghanistan or naturalized U.S. citizens originally from Afghanistan. There was one guy who was Bosnian, but they were mostly all from Afghanistan. Mohammed Zazi, the patriarch, let's call him, the father, came to the United States in 1990 as a refugee by way of Pakistan. He left his family behind in Pakistan, but arrived in New York City in 1990, got a job as, you guessed it, a cab driver. His brother also came. His brother settled in Colorado. After about 9 years, he brought his family over from Pakistan, including his son Najibullah Zazi, and they arrived in 1999. They lived in a family of 7 lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, in Flushing to be exact. They lived there for about 4.5 years. His son, Najibullah, was kind of a loser, didn't graduate from high school, was working in a job selling coffee on the streets of Manhattan from a push cart. In 2006, he went back to Afghanistan to get married and acquires a wife, and they have 2 children. He's 19 years old at the time. 2 years later, he decides to go back to Pakistan with 2 of his buddies from high school, one of whom is also a citizen of Afghanistan. By this time, Najibullah he has a green card. His father has naturalized in 2007. A year before, he decides to go back with his Afghan friend from high school and his other buddy, who is originally Bosnian. They go back, they go through the Al-Qaeda training academy on how to manufacture bombs. They come back with a plot to attack some targets in the United States, and they want to do it on September 11th, 2009. Najibullah moves out to Denver with his uncle, where he attracts the attention of the FBI because he's going around purchasing very large amounts of ingredients needed to manufacture explosives. So they were on to him. And at the same time, the FBI received some information from the UK, Scotland Yard, that they've picked up this chatter between some individuals in the UK and also the United States talking to a supervisor who's associated with Al-Qaeda and is a bomb-making expert. So they're watching and getting worried. And then Najibullah decides to travel across country from Denver to New York City in September of 2009. This really puts the FBI on high alert, and they go to New York and they start asking questions, in particular of an imam at a mosque in Queens that the family had been associated with when they were living, and the father is still living in New York City. This imam, the police thought was one of their confidential informants. Turns out he's working for both sides. FBI goes and talks to him. He turns around and calls the father and Najibullah and says, the FBI is watching you, they're on to you. So Najibullah hightails it back to Denver, and he and his relatives all start what they think is destroying all the evidence about the plot, which never takes place. And they also caught the Bosnian guy and his other high school buddy. So they do end up prosecuting all of these individuals. Najibullah is an interesting case. He was indicted and jailed, but then in 2010, a year later, moved to a secret location. And his proceedings don't go forward. The others are all prosecuted. The imam enters a plea deal and agrees to leave the United States. He's an LPR, so a permanent resident, not naturalized. So he agrees to leave. He leaves his whole family here. He's gone. The two high school buddies are both prosecuted. The Bosnian got life because he did not impress the jury at all, failed to repent, was kind of like going out of the courtroom going, yeah, I'd do it again, all over again. The other co-conspirator got 10 years in prison. So, and he has, I'm not sure what happened to him, whether he's still in the United States or if he has gone. The father is convicted of obstruction of justice and visa fraud, because the year before he naturalized, he claimed to petition for, or he petitioned for a young man that he claimed was his son, who turned out to be his nephew. Every terrorist case involving foreign nationals, you know, there's always immigration fraud in some way, shape, or form in almost every single case that I've read about. So they get the father on immigration fraud. But he is a citizen at this point. He was denaturalized finally in 2018. So almost 10 years after the initial prosecution. He finally just got removed in 2022, is how long it took to prosecute him, did his time, got denaturalized, and has been sent out of the country. His son, who actually was the one who went to training camp and was going to carry out the plot, is, from the best I can tell, seems to be in the witness protection program, more than likely still here in the United States, which indicates that he probably provided information that enabled them to get everybody else involved in the plot. But so it's an interesting case, and I'll pull together some of the threads that I see in common with some other cases. We've heard a bit about some of the recent cases of people Afghans who came in under either on SIVs or in this evacuation. We've got Ala Kazai, if I'm saying it right, who's the guy who was going on TikTok threatening to become a suicide bomber. He came in under Operation Allies Welcome. We've got Rahmanullah Lakhanwal, who shot the National Guard soldiers. He came in under a special immigrant visa. There's a guy named Jean Sati, who was caught sending money here locally, caught sending money back to his father, who was with ISIS-K. He came in under Operation Allies Welcome and got TPS. All of these cases were found out right about the same time in mid-November to early December, which I think is very interesting and needs to be looked at. I'm sure they are. Right now, they all kind of look like lone wolf types of attacks, but they did all occur around the same time period. When you hear Joe Kent and others in counterterrorism talk about the threats, they all do seem to believe that now we're facing a somewhat different threat from, not so much from al-Qaeda. They believe al-Qaeda has been weakened and so doesn't have the capability to carry out an organized attack like the 2009 subway attack and obviously 9/11 and others before it, that they're relying on these individual actors. What remains unclear is, were they coordinated, the more recent cases, by Al-Qaeda or some other terror group, or are they truly lone wolf attacks that happened sort of organically, let's say. There also have been a lot, oh, and then there's this guy, Tawhidi, who had the election day bombing plot of 2024. He was an evacuee that later got an SIV. There also have been lots and lots of criminals, people, Afghans who were brought over, who've been convicted of sexual assault, domestic violence, other kinds of pervy things. And, you know, those are, I think, a somewhat different problem, but also associated with vetting. And one thing I did notice, I looked at the ICE arrest data. The number of arrests of Afghan nationals by ICE has gone up dramatically this past year. In 2023, ICE arrested 28 Afghans, citizens of Afghanistan. In 2024, it was 59. In 2025, under the Trump administration, 226 citizens of Afghanistan have been arrested. Only about a third of them, though, for crimes. 2/3 of them have been arrested for other immigration violations, which makes me wonder if there is a national security component to those arrests, because they are, you know, not the top priority for ICE at the moment. So I think, you know, we have to wait some time to see really what was going on with these most recent cases. But I just want to point out a couple of things that I think some commonalities. Certainly these attacks that take place are always tied to events that are meaningful for the terrorists, whether it's 9/11, October 7th, or other kinds of events, whether they're working alone or as part of a larger plot. One thing that does seem to be a commonality is that they're committed by unassimilated individuals who are on the margins of American society and American communities. All of them have limited English. Only one of the cases that I've talked about, and only one that I can find out of the dozens that we can find records for in open sources, speaks English well. So they're almost all not English speakers, even after years in the United States. That was true of the Zazi family. Even though they were naturalized citizens and had lived here for a long time, they did not speak good English. The father, when, you know, in all of his proceedings, he had, you know, he could not represent himself in English. There were interpreters that were used in court. And they all seem to be reaching back to Afghanistan for some reason, whether to acquire a spouse or, as Mahvash pointed, or I think it was Leaksme pointing out, to go home to visit. They still feel very strong ties with Afghanistan. And, you know, that's something that really has to be looked at as we review some of these cases. That, to me, would be like an obvious red flag trigger for a case that needs further review, is if they're frequently going back to Afghanistan. The terror attacks manifest themselves later, even after they have been here some time. However, I'm not convinced that the actual radicalization of these individuals happened after they had been in the United States for some time. And I think this goes to what Nick was talking about, you know, that, you know, these are folks who came for reasons unrelated to wanting to be Americans or live in America, that they hold on to their views. And it may take something like an organized plot or an event or something, mental health breakdown. Lots of things can happen, but the radicalization, I think, is sort of already present. it just needs a catalyst to manifest itself in one of these attacks. And that seems to be true of not just the National Guard, the guy who killed the National Guardsman, but also like the guy who had carried out the attack in Boulder, who was Egyptian. The haystack is just huge now, though, as a result of the parole program and the evacuation. And so it's really going to be difficult for our counterterrorism professionals to look at, find these needles in the haystack. The other thing that is a huge problem is, as I pointed out, the difficulty in actually removing people who are found to present a threat. It takes a long time, particularly if they've been able to acquire a green card, and especially if they've been able to become U.S. citizens. But that's something that we can deal with through policy and changes to the law. And the evacuation happened very suddenly, relatively speaking, but the parole program went on for some time, and that was an opportunity for bad actors to exploit our system. And so I think while most of the recent cases have been SIV cases, I think we need to be worried about people who came in on parole as well. I'll just wrap up by saying, what can we do? You could be forgiven if you thought, well, we just shouldn't take anybody from Afghanistan or places like Afghanistan. I'm not sure that that's true or viable. I think, but the number of people that we can comfortably bring in is very small. And so we should make sure that it is a small number that we're talking about bringing. I also think that I fully support the effort undertaken by USCIS right now to go back and relook at all these cases and to stop new applications from being accepted. The slower the immigration process is, the better for all of us. We also need to limit chain migration opportunities because bad actors always take advantage of them. And we need to use our immigration laws, as in the case of Papa Zazi. That's how we got rid of him, was because he committed immigration fraud. So we need to use our own immigration laws as best we can in dealing with this problem.
Thanks for your time, Jessica. Over to Simon.
Well, this panel is 55 minutes, and we've got 5 left. So
Oh, sorry.
I will answer the question. Afghan vetting, can it be done? No. I think we're done here.
That's what I love about Simon. He's so precise.
Marguerite did say that the next panel is going to be short, so we can buy some time from that.
I'm just busting the chops. When you have too many smart people up here who know too much, you could take all day. Each one of these guys could give us an hour, and we'd be wanting more. I'll just sum up very briefly what I think is the issue with vetting, because I'm talking to people who've read about this and know this issue cold. I testified recently before the Senate Judiciary Committee. My 5-minute oral remarks and my much longer heritage report, which is essentially my written testimony, borrows heavily from people at this table and Jason Richwine and others and Nayla who know this subject cold. But the bottom line is vetting it's a word that means checking people's backgrounds. You're pinging against databases. So you could go door to door and ask people. Can't do that in Afghanistan. You could check the national records of that country, the police records. And there was an old computer saying garbage in, garbage out. Well, in vetting, it's nothing in, nothing out. If you got nothing in the database, you're not going to find anything. So when you show up at the airport, they're going to run your fingerprints and your face and all the rest of it, and it's going to come up clean because you don't exist. You're a ghost in the system. So what's I've heard so many times that from Mayorkas and others, the Afghans are the most vetted people who've ever come into this country. We've done the most amazing vetting. What would be a supremely vetted immigrant? Well, how about a German immigrant visa? The Germans have good records. You can't commit murder or rape in Germany and get convicted for it and not have records on the system that then we can access because they would share information with us. They would share terrorist information with us. What would be the absolute lowest information vetting countries? Places like Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, where they just don't have records. I've served in countries where if you wanted a police record, it was going to be a moldy box full of paper in some village that you could actually go to if you had the resources and time. And I did once or twice to make the point, but basically you couldn't do it. You could not check every record. And as soon as anyone sniffed that there was an American consular officer interested in this person's record, they'd smelled the money. They knew one way or the other this person probably wanted the records to disappear or to turn up clean. And it happened more times than I can count. The fraud in West Africa was stunning, and Somalia and Afghanistan both score above the countries I was posted in terms of massive fraud. So what are the consequences? Well, look, it's about averages. It's not personal, it's data. So the other day when I testified, there was this young Afghan who had been with this, I think he was an Afghan military, out there in the field with our guys, and he came back and he was a Marine here, he's a citizen, he's studying to be a nurse. We're not worried about him. He's a fantastic representative of the Afghan people and whatever town he comes from or whatever subset of the Afghan population he comes from. There are lots of law-abiding Afghans who have become wonderful U.S. citizens. This is just a matter of averages. You have to look at the averages, per country. If you look at the crime rates in Western Europe, where they've done some studies that are pretty terrifying, you find that nationals of certain countries, particularly Middle East, North Africa, commit crimes at much, much higher rates. In Denmark, they had a study that said immigrants from the Middle East committed crimes 7 times as often as native Danes. 70% of the violent robberies in Paris in 2022 were committed by people who were not French nationals. In Germany, the percentage of gang rapes, the number of gang rapes has gone up from a fairly small number to 300 in 2018 to almost 700 in 2021, and I dread to think what it is this year. I could go on and on. The Finns have done a similar study. The Netherlands, they found that non-Western immigrants were 14% of the population, but committed 40% of all crime and violent assaults. African and Middle Eastern immigrants committed crimes at 2 to 4 times the rate of native Dutch. In Sweden, 63% of convicted rapists are migrants or second-generation immigrants. Now, they found the longer that people lived in Sweden, the lower that rate went as they perhaps assimilated. But one statistic that I found said that Algerians were 122 times more likely to commit aggravated rape than Swedes. For Afghans, it was 70 times. Now, that does not mean, again, this is statistics. This is not about pointing to individuals and saying this guy is bad. But if you have zero data about a given population of, 400,000 people, and they tend to skew male. Men are like 95% of the prisoners in the United States and most other countries because, we commit more crime. And if they're young men commit more crime than old men, and children don't commit a lot of crime at all. You're simply rolling the dice. You're rolling the dice for terrorism, for murder, for rape, for all kinds of crimes, DWI. And we have let in, and we've gone into all kinds of detail how it happened, lots and lots of people about whom we know absolutely nothing. And so we're rolling the 20-sided Dungeons and Dragons dice. And unfortunately, it is a statistical certainty that the cases that Jessica cited and the ones that are in my report are just the tip of a very long iceberg that's going to melt over the next generation or so. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your very enlightening presentations. Based on what you've outlined, it's clear that vetting during the Biden-era evacuation suffered from fragmented authority, pressure to move individuals quickly, and inconsistent standards. If Congress and the executive branch are faced with this kind of a catastrophe, next large-scale non-combatant evacuation or SIV relocation, who should have final authority over vetting decisions, and what minimum standards should be legally non-negotiable to preventing warning signs like those flagged by the FBI or diplomatic security? Should those be ignored to process evacuees because they were under the chief of missions command? And after you answer this, I'll give you only 30 seconds to answer, and then we can turn to the audience.
You can give me just 10 if you want. I've used up too much of my time.
It's free for all, so you can jostle each other for this. Just kidding.
Let me just very briefly
Right.
go back to a situation that I actually dealt very closely with. Following the Operation Desert Storm, during Desert Shield, we had a no-fly zone in Kurdistan. We still have support for the people who live in Kurdistan. And there was a situation that occurred in the mid-'90s when one Kurdish group turned against another Kurdish group and invited Saddam Hussein into the country to basically clean out the other Kurdish group. And that triggered a large-scale movement of people to the Turkish border to escape Kurdistan. And the Clinton administration was faced with that. And so what they did was they sent the U.S. military attaché from Ankara up to the border to screen those individuals before they were allowed into Turkey. They were then taken in a sealed caravan to Incirlik Air Force Base, and they were flown under what was called Operation Quick Transit to Guam, where it became Operation Pacific Haven. None of those people were allowed to leave Guam. None of them were allowed to be processed out of Operation Pacific Haven until they were screened and vetted. We flooded the zone with FBI agents and with Air Force intelligence officers so that we knew every individual that was there. Now, at the end of that process, we ended up with 24 individuals that we were concerned about. We didn't leave them in Guam. We brought them to the United States so that they could be removed, so that immigration judges could take a look at their case. Operation Quick Transit was the model for what should have happened in Afghanistan. Go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We didn't, bring all of these poor Afghans who were being flushed out by the Soviets, and the Soviets were bad people. There were a lot of abuses on both sides in that war, to the United States. They went to refugee camps in Pakistan where they could, be settled. The United States provided for them, and, many Middle Eastern countries provided for them there. And, some of those individuals ended up being brought to the United States, which is why we had the level of Afghans in the United States then. We had a system that worked in the mid-90s. And yet by 2021, it was completely abandoned, along with all of the recommendations of the 9/11 report. So if we ever get in a situation like this again, we need to reestablish the refugee camp system. Send them to the northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan. There's not a lot there anyway. Provide for them there if they need to be provided for. If individuals are eligible for something, process them out of there after they are completely screened, but not until then. Remember, it's a lot more difficult to kick somebody out of the United States than to keep them out of the United States.
The big question, I think the root question we never asked was, how can we best protect those that served us? And there are 5 stands around. There's Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, and there are the groups that make up Afghanistan have minority populations in all those countries. How much would it have cost us to go to the government of Tajikistan or Uzbekistan and say, we've got a family, will you take them? $10,000? They might say, no, $20,000. Okay, you drove a hard bargain, $15,000. But it would not have cost us $500,000, which is probably what it cost us for them to come somewhere completely alien on the other side of the world where it might be much, much harder for them to learn the language, fit in, and succeed. And second, if we did decide, and this is Congress's decision or the president's, to bring certain people out whose lives were particularly at risk, and we were to say, I want 3 American officers on camera explaining that that's the guy, here's what he did for me, he should come home. I would accept that as an American citizen. I'm not going to second guess the guys in the field. And I know a lot of soldiers feel really strong about this, and I understand that. But what we did was the opposite of that. We took in people who were, building latrines who never saw an American except from a distance, and for whom no one can vouch. And that surely wasn't the intention.
100% on both sides. With respect to who should have the authority, the determining authority in deciding these, I think that's a tough one. I think that the National Counterterrorism Center should be able to have a veto over all these cases based on information that they have. I don't think anyone should have a mandatory yes authority. If there's other information, I'm a big supporter of consular non-reviewability. But with respect to criteria, it's hard to think of specific criteria that you can come up with that would add up to adequate vetting. But I do think we should look at some disqualification of people who go back to countries that they claim to have been refugees in or persecuted in. And I also think that we really need to build safety nets with a slow process as people progress along that path to citizenship, to give the government opportunities to deny them residency here. Either longer time from being allowed to enter as a refugee and getting green card status, longer time to be able to apply for naturalization. And I think denaturalization needs to be made somewhat easier, especially in cases of national security and criminal history.
Thank you. Let me turn to the audience for any questions. Apologies for eating up your break time.
Great panel. Quote, garbage in, garbage out, great insight. My question to the panel and to Art, and particularly Art, took us into the boiler room of vetting, ident, these databases. For those who, I've worked in this stuff, for those who don't know, essentially what the U.S. government does is collects all the identity information that links to a terrorist concern, the Tide list, a massive list of many, many identities. Everybody else, all kinds of other bad guys, are grouped in other databases, and they may not be consolidated. In theory, everybody who would have come to the United States would have been run through the Tide database. Back to garbage in, garbage out. How many identities did the U.S. government gather on potential terrorist suspects, let's stay on that track, that were in that database that matched the people who came to the United States? Probably very, very few. I heard from whistleblowers that when there was the predictable, based on biographic information, which is very variable, the name, date of birth, versus biometric, which is scientific in theory, you get an exact match. Go back to the biographic information. There are constant debates in the U.S. government. Is that a good match or is that not a good match? People who have a potential match that cannot be cleared up are not admitted into the United States. They're kept out. They have to be cleared before they're admitted. That was flipped by the NSC to basically say, you can come in unless you prove for sure that it's the bad guy on the list. That was a big violation of U.S. practices and never should have happened. It should have been called out, and I hope we are doing that somewhat in this panel. But I come to the bottom line, not to make a speech here, just stay on the terrorist suspect list. We do not have the capacity in the U.S. government, this is a theorem that I have, to vet these people because they're vast populations about which we know nothing. You go back to the 9/11 list. In 9/11, we had identity on Muhammad Atta, the main leader of the suspect. We were unable to match that identity to the list that would have kept him out of the country. All of his muscle that made the 9/11 attack possible were unknown to us. Even though we interviewed them and we screened them a little bit, they were unknown to us. They were not in a database. Our capacity to identify someone who was not in our database is microscopic. And as garbage in, garbage out. We don't put anything in with a hard match, we don't find the person. We could have found Muhammad Atta because we had the identity. We could not have done it with any others. Again, the theory, comment on this. We don't have the capacity to vet tens of thousands of Afghans unknown to us.
Yeah, no, that really is the issue with so much that we saw over the 4 years of the Biden administration as it came to immigration. We could adjudicate asylum applications, but we can only adjudicate them at a certain level. Once we get past that level, it becomes garbage in, garbage out. It's going to be as good as it's going to be. And the same is true of vetting any population of people, even in a country that we've been in for 20 years. We should have known everything. It didn't work that way. But Phil, you actually touch on a larger issue that goes back to all of the Biden administration immigration decisions. Sir William Blackstone wrote the commentaries on the laws of England. He's such a big legal thinker that there's a statue of him right in front of the E. Barrett Prettyman courthouse down the street. And all of what he said can really be summarized in what's called Blackstone's rule. It's better to allow 99 guilty men to go free than to punish one innocent man. And I think that the attitude of the Biden administration when it came to Operation Allies Welcome and to what happened with vetting at the border was that. Unless we can identify that this is a bad guy, to your point, we are going to let them in. We are going to take the risk that they may do something bad. That's not what the law says. That's not what Congress has said. And that's not what Congress said in this particular instance. This isn't the only Biden-era program that this was true of, but it's definitely true. You know that this was not a congressionally sanctioned program because Congress never would have, say whatever you want about Congress, they never would have set up a program like this. Blackstone's rule is great in the criminal law context. It's not good when you're gambling with national security.
The concerning part, so the Trump administration did the right thing by basically clamping down on the CARE program. But the folks who left the CARE program are now being absorbed by DHS as contractors that Leaks Me raised this issue about, the Great Hill Solutions. And they are now in charge of vetting the refugees for out processing or pushing back to those countries. So there's corruption, there's malfeasance, there's fraud, waste and mismanagement, something that we need to highlight for the Congress for oversight. And thank you all for your time and enlightenment. Appreciate it.